If there's a recall, it's a bit of spray and pray. And that's why you might, hear of, leafy greens being of a particular type being pulled off shelves in an entire state. And that's hugely wasteful because the majority of what might get recalled is actually perfectly good. If you look at the history of just innovation in general, not just within this space, you really see a history of standardization. If you look at the electrical grid, it wouldn't be what it was if we didn't have standardized plugs. If you look at the automobile industry, if I had to go look for a Subaru gas station and I couldn't just find any gas station, it would be very, very different.
Are there certain segments in the food supply chain that are kind of ahead of the game on the traceability?
I think seafood is one of them. I think if you talk to people within the seafood industry, they know all the challenges. So they know all the challenging pieces, and they say, "Oh my gosh, you're kidding, we're not ahead." But I think they're actually ahead.
Welcome to Farm to Fork, the Innovators. I'm your host, David Maloney, president of Datum FS, and I've spent over 4 decades navigating the twists and turns of the food supply chain. On this podcast, we're diving deep into the stories and strategies that are reshaping the way we produce, distribute, and serve our food. Our guest innovator today is Jayson Berryhill, co-founder of Wholechain, a blockchain-based traceability solution designed to foster trust, coordination, and transparency in fragmented supply chains. Jayson and his team are leading the way in food traceability space, especially as the FDA's FSMA 204 deadline approaches. In our discussion, we'll dive into the concept of traceability in the food industry and its significance, the impact of the Food Safety Modernization Act, Rule 204 on this sector, how Wholechain utilizes data, technology, and standardization to enhance supply chain safety, and the future of food supply chains and the potential evolution of the term traceability. So buckle up, hit that subscribe button, and let's harvest progress together. This is Farm to Fork, the Innovators, where the future of the food supply chain starts with this episode. All right, Jayson, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
So I'm Jayson Berryhill. I'm CEO and co-founder of Wholechain. I came years ago from the mobile industry, and I lived and worked in Indonesia for about 5 years. And I met my co-founder and got into this space because back when I was working for a large telecom in Indonesia, the U.S. State Department was doing a project with the government of Indonesia and that telecom, which is like the AT&T of Indonesia, and that was all about capturing data in small-scale fisheries. And so I kind of took a trajectory change in my career from the mobile space to then supply chain work. And later on, Mark and I, my co-founder Mark Kaplan, we started the business in 2019. And we do traceability across different commodities, so largely in food.
Okay, so where's your favorite spot and who has the best food?
Oh, gosh. That's a tricky one. Barcelona's always, it's tough to beat Barcelona just as a place to be. But I mean, I'm very fortunate. I get to go a lot of places for my job. And so I think last year I was in like 5 continents. So, and I was kind of all over. And so I get to travel quite a bit. I love Thai food, by far the best, but I'm easy.
Yeah. So who does Thai food better? The United States or Thailand?
Well, Thailand, obviously, but there's a few good places here. So
yeah, cool. All right, cool. All right. So you mentioned that you had a project in the fisheries industry through in coordination with the State Department when you were in Indonesia. What surprised you about that, the fisheries industry?
It's surprising how big the entire seafood space is. The FAO estimates that approximately 1 out of every 10 people on the planet owes some portion of their livelihood to seafood. It's bigger than people think. It touches a lot of different places just in our lives. I think that's true, though, about a lot of supply chains as I dig deep. Supply chains in various commodities, they converge and they diverge. And so in that particular industry, you think of it as just food, but it impacts pet food, it impacts different supplements. I mean, there's all types of different products that come from that. But that's true. I mean, when I get involved in the cattle supply chain in Brazil, you find out, oh wow, tennis rackets, all these different things, they all come from that same supply chain. And so it is really interesting, the interconnectivity of where these commodities end up going. So yeah.
Cool. All right. And again, you started Wholechain in 2019. Why?
Yeah. It was a passion and still is. In a previous conversation between you and I, you said you think this is a responsibility, and I couldn't agree more. It really is. I think I had done some times of just introspection and things that I wanted to do, and there's something about one food that just touches people's lives very differently than other, things that we come in contact with. But then with traceability, as I look at the social and environmental issues that we're dealing with in the world, the most impactful things, they really come back to supply chains. And many of the problems that are out there, they come down to a failure to even measure what we're doing in terms of how we're using the various resources we have on the planet, and then where things are going and what's happening in those supply chains and what we're not even aware of. And so it just was such an obvious thing to me that it just kind of blew my mind. And the further I dug, the more I recognized that there was such a gap there in terms of the amount of traceability that's actually out there today versus what I thought there would be. And then now even more, I just think, we're just seeing a real shift from a time where we just didn't think about that kind of thing to then we need to do things like responsible sourcing, but that alone might not be traceability, to then, wait, why aren't we tracking everything? As a global society, why aren't we tracking everything? Why aren't we doing more with the resources we have by measuring more? And that's, that was why I got into it then. And that's why, I love what I do now. So
yeah, I agree with you. I believe we have a moral responsibility, right? And so before and you talk about tracing everything, there's this little grocery store chain called Kroger, right? You may have heard of, and they are adamant that with FSMA 204, which we're going to dig in, which I'm sure is they want to trace everything, not just the stuff that's on the FTL or the food traceability list.
Yep.
And I think they make the argument, well, we don't want to build for a list that could change and expand, which totally makes sense. But also, I suspect they see the benefits in it, which we're going to dig into quite a bit. But just for everybody here, what does traceability mean for you? Can you define that for us?
Yeah, that's a very important question because I think in a world where it was lacking and now starting to emerge, even the definition of traceability kind of can become the Wild West. And so is it mapping? Is it geospatial monitoring? Is it a chain of custody? What is it? We define it very strictly by GS1 standards. So for those not familiar, GS1 is the group behind the barcode. And, they have a standard that's called, well, you don't need to know the acronyms, but they have a standard that's all about event-based traceability. So tracking not just the chain of custody that as you go upstream, but also the chain of events. So events can be anything from shipping and receiving to transformations. It could be a sensor reading. It could be all types of really rich information. But doing that on a lot level or a serialized level, serialized being like an individual item versus a lot, like you'd have a gallon of milk. But strictly doing it according to standards, because if you're not doing it according to standards, the supply chain is really beholden to a particular solution provider like ours. But that's not going to scale very well in the world. And so we see standards as a very important part of that future.
Yeah. And I think I think it speaks to Jayson and his company, just the fact that they don't want the entire world to be beholden to them, where I can make the argument, hey, maybe you do, right? From a financial standpoint, right? So I think it speaks a lot there to you. So can you also, you mentioned lot codes and stuff like that. Can you just break that down for us a little bit here, just in case somebody doesn't know what those are?
Yeah, it's interesting because the FDA in their rule, they don't even necessarily define lots, what that means.
Yeah.
And so when we say lots, I think the most simple definition that we always use internally is a discrete unit of production. And so a discrete unit of production can be a day's production on in a production facility in some kind of processor. It could also be a harvest that comes off of a farm. There's any number of different ways, but that discrete unit of production, meaning you can measure that, it's this many pounds or this many of, whatever units of measure, then you can track thereon. And that might go different directions. When you have if you open your refrigerator and look at a gallon of milk, it's going to have a lot code on it. And that lot code is in many places at once. But you can ultimately boil that down to a discrete unit of production. And so, that's really what you're talking about. And that's what allows you to measure it in the first place. So.
Yeah, and vital for the industry, right? Because otherwise, if there is a recall,
that's right.
Something that effect, if they can just recall that lot as opposed to, let's just say, instead of an entire field or an entire week of production or an entire plant,
100%.
Whatever it may be.
Well, and that's what the FDA rule, the food industry sees this new rule, and it's, obviously it's more that needs to be done. And so it's more effort involved. But at the same time, there's also benefits, and that's what the FDA looked at in creating the rule. And actually the document itself that outlines the entire rule. I mean, I think the first 50 pages are an economic analysis. But effectively, right now, without that lot-based traceability down to these various events, doing some kind of an intervention if there's a recall, it's a bit of spray and pray. And that's why you might, hear of, leafy greens being of a particular type being pulled off shelves in an entire state. And that's hugely wasteful because the majority of what might get recalled is actually perfectly good. It's just that we can't narrow it down. But the FDA rule is, I think, a very elegant way of creating a system-wide change that still puts responsibility on the individual actors within that food supply chain. And so, and it has a lot of benefits that aren't seen yet because right now it's just effort as people prepare for it. But once it comes into effect, I think you'll see more and more businesses that are beneficiaries of some of the risk mitigation that it provides.
Yeah, and I'd offer, and let's talk about this more in a little bit, but I'd offer there are sales opportunities besides cost efficiencies, right? Once you start attaching the story to the food, right? So let's talk about, you said FDA rule, just in case anybody's not familiar with it. And if you're not, I've got lots of podcasts on it, folks. I'm like episode 3 with Rick Butner, Angela, who's one of the writers from the FDA was on. But we're talking about Food Safety Modernization Act, Rule 204. Can you define that for us, Jayson?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things about the rule, but effectively it creates a mandate of traceability down to the lot level, down to the event level, just like I was talking about earlier. It is very much aligned with that standard that I mentioned from GS1. In fact, the standard that I mentioned, the acronym that I didn't mention is called EPCIS, and internally, the FDA said they're using tools that are based on EPCIS. And in a separate webinar, I found out that they're planning on ultimately releasing those tools to the industry, which I think is a very, very good thing. But what it requires of individual businesses is certain events that have to be captured as they occur within their custody. And they have to be able to provide the FDA with a list of those events, a spreadsheet, a sortable spreadsheet, within 24 hours of request. Which is a very big departure right now from what the traceability that happens in a lot of food supply chains is there. And so with that, they also have to be able to provide a traceability plan and basically the things that the FDA would need in order to go back very quickly and rapidly go through that supply chain. And I've heard kind of conjecture that it will, on average, the intent is to reduce a average 35-day kind of process of them tracing back and finding the problem to now an average of about 5 days. And when you think about that in terms of health risks, monetary risks to the economy, everything else, you can imagine all the different benefits that would have.
Yeah, and let's just face it: if it keeps people safer,
It's
if
no-brainer.
it protects consumers, I mean, do we not have a moral obligation? So, if somebody is kind of new to the industry and they were listening here, they'd be like, "Wait, are you telling me that the tomatoes I buy at the grocery store, that grocery store may not know exactly where those tomatoes came from?"
It's very common that people will know kind of one up, one down. They'll know who their suppliers are and who their customers are. If you're the supplier to that grocery store, you'd be able to track it to the grocery store, and then you'd be able to track to your suppliers. But those, it kind of ends at those connection points, the one up and one down. And so, you get POs from your customers and you send them invoices, and you also send POs to your suppliers. And so, you're gonna know those stakeholders in the supply chain. That whole supply chain is where there's a gap, because that connectivity between the entire supply chain, and that's actually the kind of the vision of our company, is connecting whole supply chains. There are tools now within businesses like ERP systems that allow companies to track, the various, again, their suppliers all the way to their customers, but it kind of stops there. And we look at the supply chain as a whole picture. And when you start asking even bigger questions around things like, emissions footprint, et cetera, then that whole supply chain becomes very important. But also when you ask questions about food safety, because maybe nothing happened at this location, but something else did at this other location. And so, and it could be, human rights. There's all types of different issues that when you look at the whole supply chain, you start seeing, other areas of risk that need to be addressed. And those risks can only be addressed when you start by measuring what's going on, by tracking what's happening.
Yeah. And is it one of the things that in doing some podcasts in the seafood space is come to my attention, at least there's a concern that the industry can have some people in the industry can have some questionable ethics at times. So even that, is that fair? And that would be able to address, right?
I think in any industry is what I found.
Enough.
I don't think it's specific to anyone.
Enough.
I think in any industry, I think it's very, you're going to have bad actors. And again, when you have opacity, it is a good condition for bad actors to thrive. And so greater traceability makes it easier to spot and then to understand, am I purchasing from those bad actors, or could I be purchasing from someone who's purchasing from someone who's purchasing from someone who's a bad actor? And that question is a very different question. And so again, that's where traceability is something that you need it. So
yeah, and I think that probably most, if I just think of produce for a second, most people would think that tomato, if we stay with the tomato, comes right off the farm, right to the grocery store. But that may not be the case. There could be, it may touch 2, 3, 4 different actors, as you say, in between, whether that's some sort of brokerage, redistribution, distribution, packing. And so, folks, there are a lot of different, again, actors in that supply chain.
Yeah.
But you may say, well, wait a minute. Even if there's 3, 4, 5 actors, come on, it's a tomato. How hard is that, right? But one, there's lots of tomatoes, and two, as you mentioned, there's a problem with the data, right?
Yeah, I mean, and this is where I think having some standardization is a necessity. And this is where I think in the past, you've seen industries fail to be able to get traceability to critical mass, because you have one-offs. And so maybe that's not a problem. Those 4 actors aren't a problem for one supply chain, because maybe they have organized around a particular solution or kind of an agreement to share data in a certain way. But if you're the average consumer, you don't really care about that. You just care about what about the one that I'm eating.
Yeah.
And so, and that means that it really is happening en masse, in an industry. And so, from our end, that's why we look at how do you standardize this to where you can have the entire industry that's ultimately doing the same thing? And that actually makes it easier on the various actors within the supply chain. So if you can imagine, let's imagine I'm a farm, and let's imagine that farm does ship directly to the store, which is very unlikely. But then I have 10 different customers, and all of them want 10 different ways of getting that data. That means I've got to go do 10 completely different things. That's not uncommon. But what if instead everybody standardized the way they do that? And I have 10 different asks, but I give them all the same thing. An example of that is email. Email is, I say to you, shoot me an email. I don't say shoot me a Gmail or a Hotmail or whatever. And so if I did, and somebody else said to you, well, give me a Gmail, and someone else says, well, give me I don't know, whatever other client there is.
Hotmail.
Yahoo Mail. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. AOL.
AOL. Send me an AOL. And so, all of a sudden it would become very cumbersome to send an email. But if you can just use one system, one method, and then achieve all of those, then it's kind of a nothing. It's just operational at that point. And that's what you need it to be, because you don't need the one-off bespoke thing for this one customer getting tomatoes that are traceable. You want all of them to be traceable, everything.
Yeah. And you mentioned the FDA, and I did like I said, I did maybe a couple months ago, there's an episode with one of the writers at the FDA, and she does a remarkable job of kind of laying out their problem. And you alluded to it, 35 days on a recall, average 35 days. And let's face it, people are at risk there. Businesses are at risk.
100%.
And a lot of if we pick on, you said leafy greens, if we pick on romaine lettuce, which is, has had its problems over the years. What about the actors or the farmers and producers that aren't even, that are producing good or don't have a problem with their product, but their product's being pooled, right? How does that impact them, right? I mean, so I mean, there's a lot of repercussions to these recalls that affect a lot of there's a snowball effect in here because the industry is not that organized. And
when people even think about traceability, they kind of have an iconic scene of that farmer. But the truck that delivered it to the store might have everything to do with a foodborne illness that's every bit as impactful as that farmer, good or bad.
That's right.
And so, again, we kind of just have this iconic scene in our mind, and therefore, same thing with, I think, seafood, very much so. I think it benefits from that, and the storytelling and everything else, which I think is a great thing. At the same time, without the conditions in between, there's a ton of risk there. And so you really kind of need that full picture in order to assess and prevent risk. From a foodborne illness perspective, from all types of different perspectives. So that's where, just that, I know the farm it came from. Well, that's great, but the person that brought it to your door might have everything to do with the problem.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah, and one other thing I do want to say about the FDA, folks, is that if you listen to that episode, they are trying to inspire the industry to do better and become more collaborative with the industry. So they aren't coming down with an iron hammer on this rule. But I would say, and Jayson, I'd be interested, if there are no penalties to the rule, perhaps there's a little bit of lack, and we'll talk about this in a minute, a lack of sense of urgency around it. But do you think there could be civil penalties?
Honestly, I wouldn't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on TV. But what I will say this is there are reputational benefits and there are reputational risks. There are definitely risks in terms of anytime there's a recall and you have unlimited exposure, there's a risk. Or if you have greater levels of exposure, there's all types of different risks that can be prevented by that. I think, I wouldn't even know what to say on the civil penalties part, but I do think that there's a number of reasons to do this And if you're within the food system and not necessarily at retail, I will say that many of the buyers, you just mentioned Kroger, but many other retailers are making decisions that go above and beyond what the rule even is in the first place. And if your customer is asking for something and your customer is very important to you, then suddenly that becomes the regulation. And because it's the person you're selling
Great
to.
point.
And that's a
Great
good
point.
thing to happen. That's a really good, a positive kind of movement. So
Yeah. And let's talk about that consumer here in a minute. But let's jump back into Wholechain. So
okay.
So what is Wholechain? Like, okay, I get it, traceability, but
Yep.
what is it? Right?
So, like I said, our tool, if you think of like QuickBooks, it records the financial transactions within a business. Our tool is kind of like that, but it's rather than the financial transactions, we're recording the movement and transformation of goods. So it's a tool for recording that information in a structured way across the supply chain. It has a number of other tools and benefits that are included, but ultimately what you get is a very structured set of information that you can share with your customers, you can receive from your suppliers, where they don't necessarily have to even be using Wholechain for you to get value from that, because you're able to get data and interpret it and then share data in a way that's interpretable according to a standard. Additionally, we have a consumer transparency tool, so the ability to scan on a QR code and see more about the product inside and see those storied elements of that supplier or of the various elements from that farmer all the way to your retailer. And so we offer those two components to our tool, and with Wholechain, we have everything from our desktop application, which is very commonly used, to our mobile app, which works offline and can be used in very upstream, very challenging situations like those farms. Only those farms could be in Madagascar or out over the ocean or wherever. Mm-hmm. And then you've got our APIs where you can pull data from an ERP system or another system where a company is tracking their inventory.
So you've got, I use the word pipes into all
pipes.
Segments of the supply chain.
That's right.
Not literal pipes, but feeds of information from all parts of that supply chain. Does everybody have to be on the Wholechain app or something? Nope. How do you get that data?
That's very important, because historically that's been the way it's worked. Large buyers says, we want to use this system. Everybody come use this system. That creates a real problem, because then, everybody's got, first of all, they're only using it for that buyer, because maybe another buyer uses a different system. And so, there's issues that arise whenever you have everything baked around a system. And so that's why we come back to standards. If it's around a standard, not a system, well, then suddenly the various actors in a supply chain, they can use a different system and we can consume data and interpret it from that system, because we're using a shared standard. And then we can deliver it accordingly as well, which allows for greater scale. And I tell people this often: if you look at the history of just innovation in general, not just within this space, you really see a history of standardization. If you look at the electrical grid, it wouldn't be what it was if we didn't have standardized plugs. If you look at the automobile industry, if I had to go look for a Subaru gas station and I couldn't just find any gas station, it would be very, very different. If you had cars that were twice the width of a common city street, there's all types of different standardized elements to those industries in our society that have scaled. And particularly that's true in the area of digital. The problem is in supply chain, that's been lacking. And so you had, not one standard that be used across the whole supply chain. And that's where we use GS1's standard, which was originally developed for pharmaceuticals and is now being used for food and other items. We use that in order to be that common standard, that plug, if you will, so you don't have one of those situations where you have like 14 different, converters whenever you travel. Whenever you travel abroad, you really don't need that in your supply chain data. And so if you can have that common standard and have a more quick, easy, seamless link, well, you're going to see traceability hit scale in those industries.
So if I understand correctly, not everyone in the supply chain, or perhaps only your customer needs to have whole chain.
That's right.
But everyone in that supply chain has to be aligned to the standards and has to be collecting the appropriate data so whole chain can digest it. Is that fair?
Yeah. And what you're seeing today is more and more, I would say, natural evolutions toward that standardization. If you look at the FSMA rule, go on to the documentation, and there's actually a great PDF that defines, here's the specific critical tracking events, and here's the key data elements for each critical tracking event that you have to capture at these various areas. That is a standard. And then one level I would say more useful is if you can specify actually the format itself. That way those KDEs, critical key data elements and critical tracking events, they can be more easily shared between systems. Well, now all of a sudden you can make that scale. A good example of that in the seafood industry, there's a group called the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability. And it's taking that same GS1 standard and it's specifically framing it out for the seafood industry. I'm on the board of the GDST, so are many other actors in the seafood supply chain, from large suppliers to large seafood brands and retailers. And it's all around creating this common standard so you can see across seafood, traceability really hit scale, but not be dependent on one particular solution provider like Wholechain or some of our competitors. So,
And the seafood industry's done some work around this already, right? With oyster tags and et cetera. I mean, they are they seem to have and probably have had to, because of the risk that's involved in seafood, have had to have kind of proven that it can work. Even if you said the tags are rudimentary, it does work to some extent, right?
I agree. And it's not only the risk, but also the challenges. Seafood is incredibly diverse. There's 12,000 seafood species. I mean, it's a hugely diverse industry. It's global. People think, shrimp, and they just think, oh yeah, I guess it's coming out of the Gulf or wherever else.
Right.
I think, U.S. shrimp, I think 6% I think is domestic right now, and 94% is imports. I mean, so it has all these challenges. It's incredibly diverse. It's got all of this, and it's still, we're seeing it happen, and we're seeing it happen more and more at scale. So can it happen elsewhere? Absolutely it can. So.
Okay. And so let's kind of take it to the operator level and maybe the consumer level. So that's great. We've got this traceability, and you mentioned the consumer transparency tool, right?
Yep.
But before we get there, like, what does, if I am a major grocer or something, like if I use your tool, or a restaurant chain, if I use your tool, I mean, how do I use it? I guess would be the question, right? How do I benefit from it? Yes, it's nice to have that traceability, but how do I use it?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, kind of like a plumber, it's only when crap goes wrong that we have to, you go dig in and have to use it. So, it is a tool where you're tracking this information with the idea that you can use it as needed whenever you need to make an intervention on that data. So it's not, really it's again, kind of like an accounting tool. You can use it to see certain reports about your sourcing, et cetera. But then also you can use it to make an intervention should there be a problem, or should you have a question about a risk, et cetera. And I would say all of the above. And I just to go one step further, this is something that we're seeing is evolving itself. So in the past, and up to now, really, traceability has been an aspiration. And so what these, retailer and food service operators are wanting is really just that kind of base provenance level information. Just they want traceability back to that kind of farm or boat. But now they're asking different questions. Now it's gone from, it's not just an aspiration. Now it's, an assumption we have, and we're going to see, I think that's what's going to change in the decades ahead, is it will be an assumption. It won't even be a question. And it'll be, because you have traceability, you can do all of these other measurements. And so how do you use it, I think, will also evolve. And you'll have things like, again, emissions footprint, other types of things that various brands and retailers and others are measuring, and it'll all depend on their priorities. So yeah, I think it'll continue to expand.
Yeah. And it's not just about recalls here. I mean, it is from the FDA rules standpoint, but this is much bigger. I don't want to say bigger, but has a lot of large implications on the supply chain, whether that's driving efficiencies, whether that's connecting brands or connecting consumer to the brand. Lots and lots of opportunity here. So you meant you started in the fisheries, right? And I was introduced to you through the seafood industry. Is the seafood industry where you're primarily focused, or where you started with Wholechain?
I would say it is a very big focus of ours.
Yeah.
We love the seafood industry. We've got a lot of experience in it, and we've got a lot of relationships there. And so we're very active in a number of different groups. Like I mentioned, the Global Dialogue on Seafood Traceability, but also other working groups and others where we can be effective in the seafood industry. But that's definitely not where we are limited. And that's a very good thing. So I'll say there's two kind of primary things about even just the name Wholechain itself. That is very intentional. One is it's not around a specific industry vertical. It's not, seafood trace or, avocado trace or whatever else.
Right.
It's made intentionally to be generic, and that's because we fundamentally believe that these supply chains converge. So, you have retailers right now that are asking questions around the soy content that goes into the feed, that goes into the salmon farm, that goes into the package, that goes into the store. And you have a convergence of different commodities there. And so it's not just seafood anymore. It's now all of a sudden soy, and maybe it's feed and it's other commodities as well. So, there's not one specific industry vertical, within Wholechain. And there's also not even the word traceability, or even an assumption, going back to it, we're not called seafood trace or anything else like that. It's just Wholechain because we think that, again, in the future, we won't think of traceability as a concept the same way we do now, because it won't be an aspiration. We'll all just do it. And so yeah, we've started in seafood, but we've also been, we've worked in cosmetics, we've worked in leather, we've worked in all types of industries, and actively work in all types of industries. And so, yeah. And so you asked me earlier about travel. I get around. When I talk about vanilla, I'm talking about from Madagascar, so on the farm.
Yeah, it's not just a movie, folks. Right. Right. Okay.
Yeah, I've been there several times.
Yeah, and so in your technology, one of the things you talk about is you use blockchain. Can you define blockchain? So define blockchain in a very high level, and then perhaps why you use it. And I think it's interesting. I was on a call this morning with a client, and he said to me, "Do you feel like blockchain's coming up a lot more now?" And I said, "Yes." 5 years ago, 6 years ago, in my prior life, blockchain became really hot because one of the large restaurant chains in the United States was starting to do pilots with it, right? And then it kind of faded away. We got a little thing called COVID came around, and we were all scrambling a little bit. But it really seems to be making a comeback. So can you define blockchain at a high level, and then why is it important here?
Yeah. So high level, again, I go with simple definitions, but it's a shared and immutable ledger. So can't be changed, and it can be seen. It is, I would say, for us, it is a feature. It's not, inherent to our application. You could technically use our application without blockchain, but it is a feature with benefits. I think some of the reason you have people getting more and sometimes less interested in blockchain is because, they kind of, someone has sold them on the idea that it's going to, cure cancer in terms of all the different problems. And it turns out that there's, it doesn't do that. And so it has its own, challenges and drawbacks, just like any technology, but it also has a lot of benefits. And that's how we look at it. And so, and of those benefits, that immutability and that shared nature of that ledger, that really makes sense for being able to view transparently information in a supply chain, and specifically to be able to validate that the claim someone has made hasn't changed over time for convenience. And so what we do with our tool is we hash data that's collected. When I say hash is a method for basically truncating a bunch of data. You could take any number of large amounts of data and you can hash it, and it puts it into a unique 64 character string. And then from that string of data, we log that in an immutable place. Now, that string is kind of like a chicken McNugget. You can make the chicken into the McNugget, but you can't make the McNugget back into the chicken. So it can't, you can't take that string and then reproduce it. But what you can do is, if you have two people that have the same data, and they're at different points in the supply chain, and one wants to validate, hey, has this person's story changed? And we both have the same data, but I want to make sure that this person's data is the same as mine. I can then hash it the same way, and I can look and see, does it match? And now we've got an immutable location that they can both go reference and say, yeah, no one else can see, because there's proprietary information in there that you wouldn't share. But now they can both go point at that and say, no, that hadn't changed. Okay, that makes sense. And that's where it's a very, very good feature. And also in the past, there were issues of just the emissions footprint of different blockchains, that kind of thing. But we use a blockchain called Algorand that has it's carbon zero. It's kind of a next generation on what you've seen in the past of blockchains, to where now you've got it being high levels of throughput. It's very efficient. And so all the drawbacks that were previously there, you really don't see with Algorand. And so it's an easy feature for us to add. So,
and is it fair to say, and I don't want to oversimplify, but when you say a ledger, we're talking about a database?
Yeah.
Okay. Just
but an open one.
An open database. Yeah. So it doesn't have, some people, I think, get a little turned off to, because they say, well, it has to have crypto. Well, that's not the case. Right.
Yeah. And you have applications that don't use, like our application doesn't use crypto. Yeah. Behind the scenes, that's what, in our case, that's what powers it, but it doesn't impact our customers. It doesn't impact any, piece. And again, it's a feature add, but it's one that's it's common to all of our customers, because it's a beneficial feature to be able to see, hey, is that data the same?
Yeah, great. And it's great to see that evolve. So what are your biggest challenges at Wholechain?
Well, you asked me the question, what is your definition of traceability? Mm-hmm. And I would say, if you go across industries and across different solution providers, you'll get very inconsistent answers to that question. And that's a very tough thing to do, because if we were kind of conquering a frontier and we both asked the question, well, how wide should train tracks be? And you got different answers to that question depending on where you went. Well, you wouldn't have a big, broad rail system, would you?
Well, and that was the problem with the train
exactly.
system, right?
Yeah.
Before the Civil War, that was the problem.
No, I actually didn't know that. I thought it was.
Yeah.
So if you want to really conquer that frontier, you really have to have a common understanding of how wide those tracks should be and some sense of the shape and everything else. And so that's why what we do now, and I keep mentioning this standardization, but that's why we really focus on it so much, is that if you really want the world to change in terms of traceability, you've got to start with that common definition of what train tracks should be. Mm-hmm. And once you get there, then you can conquer that frontier. And again, we see that frontier being broader than people even imagine, because what you think is the farm is actually just another, the farm might have its own inputs that we also need to trace, and it might have its own, issues there that we can go back further and further and further. And so there is quite a frontier out there. And so once we have those definitions, I think we'll see a lot of change in the world in terms of the way people can use that data.
Yeah, and I love your train track analogy. So, and I may be a little bit off base here, folks, but I've done research on this. I'm a history buff, but I think the train, the width and everything, the train tracks in the United States standardized until 1889.
Oh, yeah,
and one of the advantages that the North had to the South in the Civil War is they had a better standardization, and they could get goods to the front much faster. right? And so,
I'm gonna go look this up.
and if you think about it, basically everybody built trains for themselves, and it's kind of like the food industry. Everybody's got the data
That's
now
it.
for themselves, right?
Yes.
But now they're starting to recognize, well, wait a minute now. If we can standardize this and we can share this data, there are a lot of benefits. And by the way, let's talk about a moral obligation. What are your success stories today?
Oh gosh. Our success stories, I will say, they're largely the companies that we work with. Seeing them hit scale with this, seeing, I love seeing, by the way, I absolutely love what I do. I tell people all the time, if I didn't get paid to do what I do, I would pay to do what I do. But our success stories are seeing companies that are able to connect that data and make it efficient within their operation to be able to collect and share. And then start to see kind of build on that. And so, yeah, and it's funny. I don't always get asked that question. And so, when I think about it, those successes today are going to change so much in the years ahead, because it's just going to be, I think the successes we're getting today, we're just baby steps compared. I mean, just again, I don't think it's just us. I think it's just as a global society. Those successes are really connecting dots, which is, I think we're going to look back at as so rudimentary.
Yeah.
This podcast is not going to age well for me. This is what I'm saying.
Are there certain segments in the food supply chain that are kind of ahead of the game on the traceability?
I think seafood is one of them. I think if you talk to people within the seafood industry, they know all the challenges. So they know all the challenging pieces, and they say, "Oh my gosh, you're kidding, we're not ahead." But I think they're actually ahead. And I think
I'd agree
part
with
of the
that.
reason for being ahead is that standardization that's happened, and part of the reason that's even there is because people just kind of recognized the problem. They got enough scrutiny on them, and so they were having to do this so much. Things had to change, and so it evolved a bit faster than some of the others because of that. So I think you'll find that actually to be true. Wherever there's generally more risk, you'll have more evolution in terms of traceability. Prior to seafood kind of really getting where it's at today, you had the Produce Traceability Initiative and producers really pushing ahead, and that had to do with, again, you mentioned romaine lettuce, different issues there. I think you'll find going back, even again, the standard I mentioned, it was originally developed around pharmaceuticals. You had issues there, Tylenol, et cetera. And so anywhere you've had risk, you've had to have, probably just based on concern, different, evolutions of traceability and where it's gone. Now the FDA is kind of codifying that a bit more across different high-risk categories. And I think that itself will also grow. And I think it's a great foundation. The way they're asking for the information, I think, is a really good foundation to build upon for the food industry at large.
That's great. How does the consumer benefit? I mean, we've mentioned, I think the industry has a tendency to look at this and say, look, it's the FDA, it's the government, they're getting in my business, right? And they look at it as a negative. But a couple episodes ago, and actually two different podcasts a couple episodes ago, I interviewed a beef producer and a regenerative farmer. And they talked about how challenging it is to connect the consumer back to the provenance of the food, or the story of the food, or the origin of the food. And I'd make the argument that we've industrialized our food too much, that it's a race to the bottom as far as how cheap can we make it and what's the least amount of quality that we can produce. And let's face it, what's the most popular item, one of the most popular food items we have right now? Sauces.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Sauces to make stuff taste better, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, how does the consumer benefit from all this? And how does perhaps that farm benefit from it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of the things we've talked about, greater levels of safety, you know, I don't think any side of the aisle ever questions, hey, should we have clean water? And I think the same thing goes with food safety. I think it's one of those areas where all of us can pretty much agree that we need safe food, and when a danger arises, we want to get to that danger as quickly as we can, as an economy, as a society. So I think we benefit there. I think, I think people kind of think of, and our tool enables this, the idea, hey, I can scan on the QR code, I can see more about the product, I can see more about the provenance of what's inside that package, et cetera. And that is a good thing. What we have found is that consumers generally, it's not so much that scanning of that QR code that impacts purchase decisions. They kind of do that once. And in many ways, they look at it and they make a brand decision based upon transparency, not so much that, hey, I'm seeing, did Ed harvest this, the farmer or whatever. I'm seeing, the general transparency. And so, being able to make that brand decision, I compare it sometimes to politicians sharing their tax returns. I'm a concerned voter, but I don't necessarily read the tax returns, but I know the New York Times will, and so I feel pretty comfortable when they do that. It's okay. I feel pretty comfortable about the candidates. So
it's good. And so one last question here. Well, two last questions. So, is this cost prohibitive? I think a lot of people will make the argument that it's cost prohibitive. Can you give us an idea, like what this costs? I'm not talking about a subscription to Wholechain. No, I'm talking about traceability, maybe to the cost of, let's just use a tomato as an example, right? And then, oh, by the way, folks, when Jayson gives us an estimate, let's not lose sight that once you have that traceability, you can drive efficiencies throughout the supply chain that, I will tell you, my experience and the pilots I've seen actually drives a net savings back into the supply chain. So, sorry, go ahead.
No. The research is really unequivocal. That the savings are greater than the costs. I would say, on average, our customers spend fractions of a single penny per pound, and so small fractions. And so, sometimes down less than a tenth of a penny per pound. So we're not talking about anything that's substantively going to change the cost of that item at all. And so it's really just, it's shifting of behaviors, it's shifting of systems, it's all these things. But it's one of those things where there's no reason why it's not happening, and there's no reason why it won't happen. And there's a really interesting book called The Inevitable. And it's the 12 technological trends that will shape our future. And it gets into all these, and this person isn't so much a futurist in terms of saying, I'm predicting that, this is who's going to win the next election or something like that.
Right.
This is they're taking these trends and saying, these things that you'll see are inevitable. And so he describes the internet, and he says, I couldn't have told you if it'd be more of a government function or public or this or that, but he says, if you look at these different things that were happening, it was inevitable. And if you look at right now, just some of the conditions in our world, traceability is inevitable. We will see everything traceable in the decades ahead, and we'll see benefits from that we're not even thinking about now. New segments of the economy that will kind of open up because of those capabilities and how we can use data. It's a convergence of capabilities, of will, and cheaper data costs, that kind of thing. It's inevitable. So,
and you just answered the last question. What's the supply chain going to look like 20 years from now?
Yeah, again, people won't talk about traceability. It'll be assumed, and so but people will talk about all new things that we can measure. And I do think there will be a great deal more transparency, and I think there will be a great deal greater capacity to address risk, and also to deal with different risks. And for businesses, I say this frequently, good brands avoid risk, great brands engage in those areas of risk to make positive change. And they really can't do that without traceability. Because if not, if there's just an area that's very risky, like for example in the in certain areas of like Brazil where there's deforestation happening, that sort of thing, if you don't have traceability, you've got to really avoid that altogether. But if you do have traceability, you can really invest in those good actors in those challenging areas, which means that you can really cause change to happen. But you cannot do that if you don't have that traceability. And And if you don't have it, when you have to, those brands that have to pull out and just say, well, we can't get involved there because there's too much risk and we don't have traceability back to the farms, and so we can't be involved. What that really does is it leaves those areas to the lowest bidder. And what it does is exacerbates the problem overall. And that's why we have to have this. And again, that's why I generally believe it's inevitable.
Folks, otherwise it's a race to the bottom.
Yeah.
Right? It's a race to the bottom. Well, Jayson, this was awesome. Thank you, and congratulations on your business.
Thanks so much. Good being here.
And that brings us to the end of another insightful journey through the fields of innovation on Farm to Fork, The Innovators. It's an honor to have you listen. If you found today's episode as fascinating as we did, don't forget to share it with a friend, write a review, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another episode. Farm to Fork is not just a podcast, it's a community of forward thinkers and change makers. Your thoughts and ideas matter to us. Reach out on social media or through our website, datumfs.com, and be a part of the ongoing conversation. As we wrap up today, remember, the future of the food supply chain is in our hands. Stay curious, stay innovative, and let's continue growing together. Until next time, this is David Maloney signing off from Farm to Fork, The Innovators. Thank you for being a part of this community. See you in the next episode.